Independence is my character. These words are not just a slogan, but a revolutionary theory. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was not merely a spectator of history. He was its mathematician, its engineer, and today we embark on a journey to understand both his struggle against colonialism and how mathematics became a weapon of freedom for humanity. Imagine this. In the 1910s, amidst the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, colonial powers were using the world map like a chessboard. But then Mustafa Kemal emerged and broke the rules of the game. At Gallipoli, not only bullets, but numbers spoke, ammunition, calculations, troop placements. Mathematics became a weapon, a strategy. Atatürk drew power from the science, not just on the battlefield, but in his thoughts as well. Now, picture this. A laboratory and Atatürk standing at his desk. In his hand, a ruler, a pen. But the formulas were not only physical, they were social. He says equality, justice, and independence are also equations. Colonialism is the breaking point of the equation. Atatürk didn't just defend physical lands. He taught his people the ways of thinking, questioning, and calculating. He turned education into a scientific shield against colonialism. The early 20th century, the world was a chessboard, and the Ottoman Empire was a cornered pawn. Europe's colonial powers were carefully moving every piece to break apart this empire. But then, someone emerged, not a general, but a genius, not a mathematician, but a strategist who checkmated his opponents with his mind. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Imagine this. In 1915, at Gallipoli, the most sophisticated armies in the world history bowed before the intellect of a young commander. This was not just a battle, it was a hole punched in the seemingly impenetrable wall of colonialism. Atatürk didn't just change the destiny of Turkish nation here. He changed the future of all oppressed people. This was the spirit that made Gandhi ask, if Turkey succeeded, why can't we? However, Atatürk's vision was not just about victories won on the battlefield. No, the true battlefield in his mind was the darkness of ignorance. One of the first actions upon founding the Republic was to initiate educational and scientific reforms, because colonialism was not just a physical yoke, it was a mental shackle. The only way to break that shackle was to arm the people with science. Picture this science. Atatürk in a classroom, standing before a blackboard. He holds a piece of chalk and writes in a large letters, "Science and reasons are the doors to freedom." And he says, the laws of mathematics are like this. What is true is destined to win in the end. If a notion is armed with science, no imperial power can enslave that notion. Thanks to this visionary mindset, Atatürk not only encouraged the Turkish people, but also urged oppressed nations around the world to fight against colonialism with science and logic. He wrote the formula for independence not just on battlefields, but in educational curricula. And remember, this message still lives on now. It is up to us not only to preserve that spirit of independence, but to carry it further in the light of mathematics, science, and reason. Imagine this. In 1930s, Turkey, the majority of the population was deprived of education, and scientific terms were a mystery to the people. Atatürk takes up his pen and writes a book. But this book is no ordinary book. This is a revolutionary that turns mathematics into a language of the people. The revolution, the book of geometry. In writing this book, Atatürk did not just simplify mathematic terms. He planted the first seeds of scientific thinking in the minds of the people. For example, instead of the term "musellas," which was used up to the point, he simply said triangle. And murabba, its name was now square. This change may seem simple, but they symbolized a profound transformation, because in order to make a nation competitive in the modern world, the way it thinks had to be changed first. For Atatürk, mathematics was not just a science, it was a philosophy of life. He placed logical thinking at core of his leadership understanding. Just like a geometric problem, he analyzed issues, defined variables, and applied the solution step by step. Even his military strategies carried the aesthetics of mathematics. Remember the epic defense at Gallipoli, calculating enemy lines, distributing ammunition, and precisely planning timings. All of these were living forms of mathematics. Now, close your eyes and imagine Atatürk is standing before a board holding a right piece of chalk. He writes in large letters, "Logic is the compass of nations." Then he turns to the crowd and adds, "Mathematics is not just numbers. Independence is also an equation. If I cannot teach my people science and logic, I cannot complete this equation. Freedom is won, not only by arms, but by reasons." Atatürk's book of geometry is more than just a mathematics book. It is a manifesto that places the minds of the people within the coordinate system of modern thought. The vision not only illuminated the path of Turkey, but also that of humanity. Atatürk's decisions, Atatürk's dedication to mathematics freed his people from ignorance and elevated them to the heights of rational thoughts. Because logic and mathematics are the only true foundations that will allow a nation to remain independent through the ages. Now, let me ask you, if Atatürk was able to rebuild national independence with mathematics, why shouldn't we use that power in our own lives? Because yes, independence is a character, but it is also an equation. Now imagine this, a map with borders, occupied lands and enemy flags. But when Atatürk looks at this map, he sees only one thing, the colonization of minds. For him, colonization was not just about conquering land. The real danger was chaining people's mind. And the only way to break this change was through the guidance of science and free thought. Atatürk knew that independence could not only be won through military victories, but also through science. When he said, "Without science and logic, independence is impossible," he was writing the recipe for building a nation's future. Mathematics and geometry were the essential components of this recipe, because these disciplines shape the way individuals and societies think, guiding them to analyze and question. Let's look at Atatürk's book of geometry. Is it just about simplifying terms? No. This book is a revolution that introduced the people to scientific thought. Every word of that book was not just a mathematical term, but a manifesto for independence, because the greatest force that will comfort colonization is minds equipped with logic and science. Atatürk said, if a nation's mind is chained, that nation cannot escape captivity. But science is the most powerful key. Mathematics is the anthem of human freedom. And remember, there is no free thought. There is neither independence nor future. Atatürk's approach to fighting with science is a model, not only for the Turkish people, but for all of humanity. For him, science could change not only the fate of individuals, but also the fate of societies. And this is not just a revolution, it is an evolution. Thus, independence is an equation written with science, a paradox solved with logic. Today, we live in a world equipped with his legacy, but no understand the value of this legacy. We must act with science and logic, because without science, independence is just a dream. And let us not forget, Atatürk's vision left us not only a struggle for independence, but also a philosophy of life. Now, I ask you, is your mind free? Because independence is the dance of free minds. Now, take a deep breath. We will delve into the very DNA of Atatürk's thoughts and vision. He didn't just make a nation independent. He carried that nation into the infinite universe of science and logic. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was not just a leader. He was a revolutionary who redefined the potential of the human mind. The victories he won on the battlefield were crowded by silent revolutions initiated in the minds. His struggle against colonialism continued not with just swords, but with pens, logic, and mathematics. His vision was not only to save the fate of his people, but to empower them to write their own destinies. Atatürk's beliefs in science was one of the cornerstones of his victories. On the battlefields, his strategies were not just determined by military skill, but by mathematical precision. Every independence victory won under his leadership was a step towards a future based on science. After the proclamation of the Republic, his real struggle began: the liberation of minds from occupation. He refined education as a weapon for every individual and armed his people with it. The geometry book he wrote was not just about simplifying mathematical terms, it was a key that transformed the way his people taught, a guide that allowed them to people the doors to universal science. Atatürk knew this. Science means freedom. His philosophy was built on his idea that the light of science should illuminate that path of every individual. Mathematics was at the core of his philosophy because it was universal. Numbers knew no nation, borders, or language. Through the teaching of mathematics, the Turkish nation learned not only numbers, but also universal freedom. Today, Atatürk's words about the intelligence and diligence of Turkish nation are not just precise, they are a challenge. His vision of scientific independence is still alive. Not "it's our turn." Now it's our turn. Will we fight with science? Will we walk with logic? We will rise with universal thought? Atatürk left us all a universal prescription. The truth, the truest guide in life is science. To keep this legacy alive means to carry the anthem of independence forever. And remember, where there is a science, there are no boundaries. Now, it's time to take up the flag of science and logic. I ask you, are you independent? Then walk with science, because the march of independence never ends.